Afreximbank, what it's trying to do and what it has done is to offer visionary leadership and providing foresight so that we can take our own development and so we can own our own development and our own agenda. I'm an economist, and you know economists, we like to give advice by looking in the back mirror. However, the bank is slightly different. It likes to look forward, relentlessly forward, imagining and defining the future, understanding the constraints and market failures that are holding us back, correcting these and being bold about setting ambitions for the continent. One constraint or market failure the bank has identified is setting our own internal limits, limiting our ambitions around our thinking and our ideas. So I see this lecture as a way of expanding our thinking and to own our own development agenda. They have brought prominent Africans as well as original global thinkers. The first lecture that we worked on had a Singaporean, Professor Kishori Mabuni. His thesis was, be pragmatic. He says, learn from others and move at pace. He also said, quoting Singapore, that the D of discipline is often more important than the D of democracy. 2021 saw the President of Mauritius, Amina Gurib Fakim. Her thesis revolved around science, biodiversity, and investing in medicine. Africa counted, I remember her saying, just 365 pharmaceutical companies compared to 7,000 in China and 11,000 plus in India. And she also said that only 2.4% of researchers in science across the world were African, only 31% of whom were women. 2022 brought Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, before I should say she was a superstar, so the bank already knew the tremendous personality that she had, and it had all the hallmarks of a Babacar Ndiaye lecture: solidarity, humanity, collaboration between the diaspora and Africa, what the bank today calls global Africa, as well as a claim to our rightful place in a world and against a system that has too often been rigged against us. And last year saw the founder of polling and data specialist Gallup, who called for a new era of entrepreneurship, saying that entrepreneurship was often more important than innovation. And we needed to unleash the entrepreneurs on the continent to build truly great global companies. So when I saw the name of this year's lecture, I could not have been more delighted. This is a leader who you'll hear from shortly, who has taken the world public service quite literally, putting people and country before a personal agenda. So tonight's lecture will be around saving lives today versus saving the planet for the future. Can the AFCFTA resolve the climate change dilemma? So before we get to our lecture, there is simultaneous interpretation, so whoever needs a headset, there are headsets outside. But I'd like to ask you to stand for the Afreximbank anthem. If you can all stand, please.
From within the shores of the motherland and far beyond, with dignity we rise and we build a bridge for all. With integrity, respect, trust, excellence, commitment, creativity. We will build for Africa's prosperity. We will build for the now and posterity. As we're standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa straight. Oh, we are Afreximbank. We will build for Africa's prosperity. We will build for the now and posterity. As we're standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa straight. Oh, we are Afreximbank. Wait, salam. Oh, yeah, my wait, salam. Oh, yeah, my wait.
Thank you. You can take your seats. And I can say that the bank is transforming more than just Africa's trade. It's transforming Africa. So next we've got the Babacar Ndiaye lecture welcome video, please. Cue the video, please. So before our lecture, I'd like to invite His Excellency Professor Benedict Orama, President and Chairman of the Board of Directors at Afreximbank, to make some welcome remarks. A once-in-a-generation leader, a tireless and relentless champion of Africa. Professor Orama, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Omar. Our esteemed guest speaker, His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, former Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Honorable ministers, governors of Central Bank, and other senior government officials who are represented here, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, members of the diplomatic corps, heads of international organizations, my colleagues at Afreximbank, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 8th Babacar Ndiaye lecture series, an annual knowledge event dedicated to memorializing the late Dr. Babacar Ndiaye, the 5th president of African Development Bank, whose 2 terms of office ran from 1985 to 1995. We are most grateful to our keynote speaker, His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, former Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, who agreed to deliver this year's lecture despite a very short notice, arising from the unavoidable circumstances that made it difficult for Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, to perform that role today. Professor Osinbajo is an extraordinary climate enthusiast and supporter of Afreximbank. The bank is proud to be his partner in an innovative, potentially high-impact climate initiative he recently conceived. It is a thing of joy that instead of his giving us his insights as a panelist, as earlier scheduled, we now have the honor of drawing from his trove of knowledge as a keynote speaker. It is credit to his remarkable humility that we have been able to achieve this transition seamlessly. I thank you again, Your Excellency. We're also very grateful to Her Excellency, Dr. Amina Mohammed, for her recorded remarks, notwithstanding the constraints of the engagements that prevented her from joining us physically today. Special thanks to you all, our esteemed guests, for making this event a priority in your very busy schedule here in Washington. Your Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, there's a tribute video of Dr. Babacar Ndiaye, which you will watch. It's only a tip of the iceberg of the profound positive impact of the late Dr. Babacar Ndiaye on Africa. Dr. Ndiaye was an extraordinary visionary, the man who did not only see tomorrow, but pointed the way for those after him to get there. He firmly believed that it was Africans and African institutions that held the key to a sustainable transformation of the continent. It was this conviction that led him to conceive and lead the creation of several Pan-African institutions endowed with unique features that gave them a fighting chance against the virus of dependency and the strategy of divide and conquer that had kept Africa and Africans down for decades. He also championed the creation of Afreximbank and ensured that it was infused with a full dose of those unique features in terms of its purpose, ownership, and governance. Any progress and advancements Afreximbank can lay claim to today is owed largely to Dr. Ndiaye's great institutional architecture that forces the culture of self-reliance on the bank and its employees. Events since the mid-1990s have validated the vision and ingenuity of Dr. Ndiaye. From a continent that was brought to its knees in the 1980s when a devastating international debt crisis struck, Africa has since the late 1990s contended with unprecedented economic and health shocks. During most of those crises, African multilateral financial institutions, through Dr. Ndiaye's effort, such as Afreximbank, played key roles in mitigating the impacts. Some examples include the commodity crisis of 2015 and 2016, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 2021, and the Ukraine crisis of 2022 to 24. As an example, Afreximbank launched countercyclical facilities that responded to each of these crises and disbursed significant amounts on a revolving basis in each case, including $10 billion during the 2015-2016 commodity crisis, $8 billion against the COVID-19 pandemic, and about $25 billion during the early years of the Ukraine crisis. Other African multilateral financial institutions also ran highly impactful counter-cyclical programs to counter those crises. It is on account of the foregoing that when we look back, we ask, what if there were no African multilateral financial institutions? What if there was no Afreximbank? And indeed, what if there was no Babacar Ndiaye? Dr. Babacar Ndiaye's legacy was indeed unparalleled. We used this annual lecture series to celebrate him, his vision, his courage, his tenacity, and his love for Africa and humanity. We use the lecture series to encourage all Africans all over the world to go and do likewise. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as far back as the 1990s, the late Dr. Ndiaye recognized the threat posed by the rapidly evolving global climate crisis. Notwithstanding the tremendous financial and economic shocks that plagued Africa and the world during his presidency at the African Development Bank, Babacar Ndiaye was most concerned by the long-term threats posed to humanity by climate change. He once said, and I quote, "Climate change is the greatest threat to development, particularly in Africa, where millions of people depend on the environment for their livelihoods. Africa's economic transformation cannot happen without addressing climate change." So Ndiaye's reflection on the impact of climate change was spot on and intellectually deep. It was logical to expect that the people that depended on the environment for their livelihoods could be the most impacted by uncertainties and destruction inflicted by climate change. It's no wonder then that the United Nations estimated that climate change cost African countries 5% of their GDP annually. The situation is harsher for economies most dependent on rain-fed agriculture, whose farms have been most devastated by recent climate events that brought several months of devastating drought across Southern Africa and also flooding in some parts of East Africa. Disappointingly, the global debate on climate has been so much focused on emissions reduction, with the question of reducing the impact on Africa and other developing countries always reduced to a footnote. A call for Africa to decarbonize when the continent has not even carbonized poses a serious threat to the socio-economic development of a gas-rich continent that has at least 600 million people of the about 680 million people in the world without electricity. There appears to be scant attention paid to balancing the needs for a decent livelihood for poor people who had and still have contributed little or nothing to the loads of the devastating carbon in the atmosphere, and the imperative of ensuring that those who spew out those carbon emissions cut them down as quickly as possible. Being the most negatively impacted by climate change, Africa has recently offered alternative solutions to combating the climate crisis, a solution that does not compromise on Africa's trade and economic development. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, signed in 2018 and which came into force a year later, is seen as a potent means of reducing carbon emissions, as it is helping to domesticate industrial activities and minimize the carbon emissions caused by shipping. of commodities to faraway lands for value addition and reshipping to Africa and elsewhere. We believe that the AfCFTA could offer a pathway to a just transition, enabling local industrial value addition while protecting the planet. Your Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, some of the important climate-related questions that confront us today are: how do we balance the need to save the environment with the need to promote broad-based economic development in Africa? And number two, can the global community embrace the AfCFTA as one credible solution to the climate crisis? And how can we deepen its positive impact on climate? To address these pertinent questions, we are glad that His Excellency Professor Shibanjo agreed to avail some of his his time to join us today. Professor Shibanjo is a strong climate advocate Africa has. And being a public official of a country that relies heavily on fossil fuels, his thoughts and perspectives on the Balancing Act will be most useful and could present a blueprint for all fossil fuel-dependent economies around the world. As we look forward to an intellectually stimulating session, allow me to thank all those who helped us in putting this event together, especially Afreximbank event and research team, as well as our event consulting firm, Brand Communications. Special thanks to our moderator, CEO of IC Communications, Omar, for always being there for the bank. Special thanks to all of you for joining us to celebrate Dr. Babacar and Ndiaye, the great Pan-Africanist. I thank you all for your kind attention.
Professor Arama, thank you very much. You know, we will always follow you, and all you have to say is jump and we'll say how high. So before we go to the lecture, there is a tribute video, as Professor Arama has told us. So if you can just have the tribute video for Dr. Babacar Ndiaye.
Today, we celebrate a Pan-African visionary leader who lived decades ahead of his time. The late Dr. Babacar Ndiaye, the former president of the African Development Bank. As a trailblazing architect of a new era, he dreamt of an African future controlled by Africans and African institutions. He dreamt of an institution that will lead the continent to its promised land, a Pan-African trade finance bank. A remarkable institutionalist who at first, as president of the African Development Bank, AFDB, in 1985, envisioned among many institutions a Pan-African trade bank to deal with the challenges of the time and championed the course of Africa's trade and economic development in the years ahead. At a time when Afro-pessimism, financial turmoil, and constrained trade landscapes dominated the 1980s, skepticism surrounded the idea of a dedicated trade finance bank for Africa. But Babacar Ndiaye remained steadfast in his belief. In his reflections, the first president of Afreximbank, Mr. Christopher Edordu, said of this avowed institutionalist, his tenacity, courage, and persistence made him pursue the idea of an Afreximbank without wavering. Some told him they would not support the idea of an Afreximbank. Others told him, after Afreximbank was set up, that it was a mistake. And his successor, Mr. Jean-Louis Ekra, remarked that Dr. Ndiaye not only conceived the Afreximbank project, but pursued it tenaciously, against all odds, to make the project a reality. The exemplary vision he exhibited in conceptualizing the project was only matched by the zeal and doggedness with which he ensured that the vision of a Pan-African trade finance institution became a reality. On his part, Professor Benedict Orama, the third and current president of Afreximbank, said, Babacar Ndiaye was an epitome of today's African financial landscape. He probably pioneered the first serious step towards addressing the fundamental problems facing Africa. Perhaps the most transformative step taken by an African since the establishment of the African Development Bank in 1960. Dr. Babacar Ndiaye's passion for Afreximbank never waned on establishment. A decade later, he said, considering the difficult operating environment during the last decade, I feel satisfied that the bank is solidly on the road towards a full realization of our dreams. From his sweat, sacrifice, and selflessness, Africa today can boast of an institution it owned and controlled that has become the cornerstone for the delivery of Africa's economic agenda. The African Continental Free Trade Area is taking shape. Thanks to this child of necessity, industrial edifices are expanding across Africa, thanks to this bank. And Africa can now look inward to its institution to manage the impact of global crises. The hope of economic emancipation is becoming real. From Afreximbank to the African Business Roundtable, and from Africa Reinsurance Corporation to Shelter Afrique, Dr. Babacar Ndiaye left indelible institutional footprints that are today helping to shape Africa's development trajectory.
And it's great that we've got Dr. Babacar Ndiaye's family here with us. You'll see them a bit later on tonight. So thank you for being here. So we've now arrived to lecture time. So there will be a Q&A at the end. So please do take notes. And if you've got questions for His Excellency the Vice President, you will be able to put them to him. So I've been given a very long bio here to read about His Excellency the VP, but I prefer to go to his Instagram account. So I'd like to introduce His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, who's a proud dad, a proud grandpa, a pastor, a professor of law, a senior advocate of Nigeria, a citizen, and of course the former Vice President. Vice President, the floor is yours. Warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really feel a bit sorry for you all this evening because here you are all ready for dinner and I'll be speaking for at least 3 hours. But fortunately also for you, President Orama has already made most of my speech, so I don't think I'll be speaking for anywhere near that long anymore. But let me say how deeply grateful I am to the President of Afreximbank and his team for affording me the honor to memorialize Babacar Ndiaye, a far-sighted visionary who before 1993, when the bank was founded, saw today, the day when Afrexim would be a leading global force for development finance in Africa. And the exploits of this very committed Pan-Africanist who used to say, and I quote, "Senegal is my village, Africa is my country," are rightly the stuff of legend today. His place in this generation, as we've heard already, as the foremost contributor to the ideation and execution of development, finance, policy, and practice in Africa is firmly secure. May his memory always be blessed. I'm speaking on the topic saving lives today versus saving the planet for the future. can the AFCFTA, the free trade agreements, resolve the climate change dilemma? The topic, of course, deliberately creates a false choice, since we really cannot choose to live today as a bargain for dying tomorrow. The topic, I think, is meant to provoke our response to the crucial point that Africa faces two existential crises, not one: climate change and poverty. And then, of course, to answer the question, by what means can the free trade agreement resolve the dilemma of African nations who desperately need growth, jobs, livelihoods, and food security, without at the same time worsening the climate crisis? Regarding the climate crisis, we all know, of course, that Africa is warming faster than any other region. And practically everywhere in Africa, the catastrophic consequences are evident. The Horn of Africa has been facing its worst drought in 40 years, with 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons since 2020, with prolonged droughts in Kenya, in Somalia, and intense flooding in West Africa, especially Nigeria, Niger, and Ghana. In Southern Africa, Cyclone Freddy wreaked havoc in Mozambique, in Malawi, and Madagascar. Yet Africa, as we know, is the least emitter of dangerous gases, barely 4% of global emissions. The cause of these catastrophes are the result of historical and cumulative emotions from mainly global north countries. Ironically, Africa experiences greater devastation and is far less capable of mitigating the damage and losses caused by these extreme weather events. But Africa's other existential crisis is poverty. Over a third of Africa's population lives in extreme poverty, with population growing faster than GDP. Unemployment, food security, of course, are huge challenges. The major economic sectors, such as agriculture, mining, and energy, are resource intensive, and that contributes to environmental degradation, of course, at great cost. Africa's leaders face the very difficult trade-offs between accelerating growth in sectors that worsen climate change or delaying development for environmental concerns. A significant contributor to the poverty situation is energy poverty, which essentially means lack of access to energy, electricity for cooking, heating, cooling, and this, of course, inhibits any real growth or job opportunities. All the evidence that we see demonstrates that the availability of energy directly correlates with income, wealth, and development, both at the individual and societal level. And the energy poverty issue in Africa is massive. As we've heard, over 600 million Africans have no access to electricity, and another 150 million have irregular access. But let us throw in the mix yet another problem. Most African countries depend on fossil fuels for their energy needs. And for fossil fuel-rich African countries, this is also a major source of export earnings and fiscal revenues. But ostensibly in keeping with their net zero obligations, there has been a growing trend among development finance institutions to withdraw from fossil fuel investment. These actions include the World Bank's decision to cease funding for upstream oil and gas development in Africa, and the restrictions on financing downstream gas development by the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland, and the United States. Now, clearly, the implications of these actions are dire, where there are no immediate alternative sources of power, and the cost of transition to cleaner fuels may be prohibitive. Some studies show that divesting from fossil fuels could reduce GDP by as much as $30 billion for Nigeria, $22 billion for Algeria, and $19.3 billion for Angola. Also, for gas-rich and energy-poor countries in Africa, the argument for gas, at least as a transition fuel, is simple enough. In the face of energy poverty, with millions lacking access to power, and 1 in 4 deaths of women in rural areas caused by pollution from the use of firewood, what sense does it make to leave this versatile, relatively low carbon fuel in the ground, where it offers today a cheap and available source of electricity for domestic and industrial use, and LPG for clean cooking? Besides, even if Africa, aside from South Africa that is, triples its electricity consumption solely using natural gas, this would barely add 0.6% to global emissions. That there must be a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy has become a fact of life. But that transition must be just and equitable for all parties, especially for Africa, who has been asked to make more sacrifices than her very low contribution to the problem demands. Now, this is even more compelling because the Global North's position has been consistently shown to be, to put it mildly, a case of double standards. Because while aggressively pursuing fossil fuel-rich African countries to transition to renewable energy, they maintain gas projects as an important part of their multi-decade decarbonization plans. And of course, many continue to develop new gas projects. Afrexim's collaboration with the African Petroleum Producers Organization to produce an African Energy Transition Bank dedicated to supporting the oil and gas industry through the transition process, I think will be very helpful in making this transition as painless as possible. But for Africa, the crucial question in the energy transition conversation is how Africa is to develop, provide well-paying jobs and decent lives for its growing population within internationally agreed carbon constraints. Historically, economic growth goes hand in hand with emissions growth. And this is the pathway that global North countries have gone. And that's why we are at this point of an imminent apocalypse, if we are to believe the scientists. If Africa were to grow along the same carbon-intensive trajectory to middle to high income status as the North has done, we would be adding 9.5 gigatons of CO2e emissions annually. And by 2050, we will be responsible for 75% of global emissions. But more importantly, the global net zero targets of the world, that is, would be impossible to attain. So to achieve its net zero ambitions, the world needs Africa to take a carbon negative path to development. Or put simply, the world needs Africa to develop without increasing carbon emissions. So Africa can therefore be either the solution to the climate crisis or the nemesis of the world. How and why? How will Africa be the solution to the climate crisis? It is by pursuing a pathway of climate positive growth, or simply a green pathway to economic growth. Why? Because we have climate competitiveness. As the world increasingly pays for climate solutions through consumer preferences, a price on carbon, or simply rules that force a shift to lower emission solutions, the places in the world that can provide green solutions at the most cost competitive prices have a massive economic opportunity. And thanks to Africa's abundance of high quality, untapped renewable energy potential, our young and entrepreneurial workforce, and our relevant natural assets and resources, we have the key, all of the key ingredients to be a major climate action powerhouse. Indeed, our low industrial base, our low carbon footprint, can actually be an advantage, enabling us to develop greenfield clean energy manufacturing, saving us the cost of abandoned legacy carbon-intensive manufacturing projects. And then by pursuing an industrialization pathway using renewable energy, of which we have 60% of the world's potential, we can develop the first green industrial civilization. We can indeed green global manufacturing and supply chains, We can protect our carbon sinks and remove carbon from the air at the same time. We can achieve economic growth without growing emissions or even keeping emissions constant. This way, we can realize inclusive economic growth, job creation, and livelihood improvement by being part of the climate solution. At the Africa Climate Summit in September of 2023, the AU endorsed this notion of climate positive growth as the economic and development paradigm for Africa. But the question, of course, for this lecture is how can the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements support the climate positive growth paradigm in order to deliver on the promise of jobs and producing green industrialization across Africa? The free trade agreements creates the world's largest free trade area by number of participating countries. It creates a single market of 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of 3.7 trillion US dollars. The agreement will remove tariffs for 97% of all tariff lines and not less than 90% of all trade, and develop African economies by intra-African trade in value-added manufactured goods and commodities, and allow free trade for services across the continent. Now, there are two obvious advantages to a fully operational free trade agreement of this particular agreement. The first is that 42% of African countries, aside from North Africa, now have legislation prohibiting the export of raw ores or minerals. So such must be processed before export. So this gives African countries the benefit of jobs and revenues from local beneficiation and manufacture. Second, shipping is a major source of CO2 emissions, and I think it comes like sixth in the order of ranking. And under current trade practices, a large share of African raw materials is exported to other regions where they are processed or manufactured into finished products, usually using fossil fuel power sources, before being shipped back to Africa for consumption. This cycle not only contributes to high emissions, but also constitutes a loss for African countries, who of course do not reap the value of the value chain gain from beneficiation. Intra-African trade in finished goods will substantially reduce this massive cause of global emissions. The reduction of emissions by virtue of intra-African trade has been the subject of quite a few empirical studies, and I'll just refer to one of them. And that's a recent ECA CPII study, which is entitled Greening the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement's Implementation. And that was published just last year, December last year. And that study found that implementing the free trade agreement can boost intra-African trade by 35% going to 2045, while increasing emissions by less than 1% compared to no free trade agreement or climate policies. But I think it's important to point out that a lot of the studies on this matter are studies that do not factor in the use of renewable energy sources in the processing or manufacture of traded goods. And this is an assumption of the climate positive growth paradigm, which would again substantially reduce emissions. I think it's important to emphasize that point, that the whole point of the climate positive growth paradigm is that renewable energy resources will be used for manufacture, or be primarily used for manufacture, which of course will substantially reduce emissions even before shipment of goods anywhere. So if Guinea, for example, which has 25% of global deposits of bauxite, process the bauxite it mines to aluminum with renewable energy in readiness for export, it will save the world 335 million tons of CO2e per year. That's 1% of global emissions. It will create 280,000 jobs and generate $37 billion in additional revenue. If it chose to sell the aluminum within Africa, it will again save the huge cost of shipping out of countries thousands of miles away. A Bloomberg study for the AFDB, which was done in 2021, on the manufacture of battery precursors found that manufacturing battery precursors in the DRC, which of course has plenty of lithium and cobalt, is 3 times cheaper than manufacturing in the US, in the EU, or even China. And manufacturing in DRC would also extend value chain opportunities to other African countries. They would need manganese from Zambia, Tanzania, Gabon, and South Africa to contribute to its capacity to produce these battery precursors. So manufacturing using renewable energy would significantly reduce the cost of manufacturing. And Africa's renewable energy is not only just abundant, especially solar energy, but it also has very low seasonality or intermittency, which makes it possible to reliably provide renewable baseload to power continuous industrial production. So the economic case for renewable technologies for manufacturing is getting stronger by the day. Last year's IEA publication showed that already the total cost per kilowatt hour of grid-scale solar, including storage, is now lower than that of gas-peaking technology, even without valuing fossil fuel price volatility and without putting any price on emissions whatsoever. And that's a very important point, especially as we think about transition from gas. It's becoming more obvious that renewable energy is coming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Also, the production and export of low-carbon fuels, such as hydrogen and ammonia, that's another great opportunity for African countries. And in the past 5 years, we have seen green energy projects in Africa reaching final investment decisions all across Africa. Namibia recently has received almost $500 million in investments in hydrogen. And its substantial investments in solar energy and other renewables, the clean energy that's required for hydrogen production, has made it attractive for this type of investment. And some of that hydrogen, we're told, is going to be considered to power rail transportation in Africa. Angola is also set to become the first exporter of green ammonia to Germany by 2025. Its full capacity, that's Angola's full capacity for green hydrogen, is planned for about 280,000 tons annually. And there are other countries that are also investing in green hydrogen. It's Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, and Mauritania. They all have very aggressive hydrogen production goals. So for Africa to produce or to pursue a climate-positive growth path in trade and manufacturing, I think there are at least 6 things that African countries need to do. The first is that we need to speak with one voice and show up as shapers and not just takers. In other words, we need to be at the table shaping policy. As diverse as Africa is, we have plenty in common. And showing up with a unified, proactive stance is key to getting our agendas recognized and incorporated into emerging global rules and instruments. In that respect, the recent AMCEN, or the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, their recent decision to integrate the efforts of the Africa Group of Negotiators, the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change, and the implementation of the Nairobi Declaration, including Africa Green Industrialization, into a shared AU agenda, is an important recognition of this need for coordination and alignment. Just as we did with the Marrakesh Declaration, aligning and shaping Africa's engagement on reform of the MDB system, we need to lean in again in an integrated way. 2, we need to put our house in order and deal with the obvious governance issues of transparency and accountability, especially in public procurements, protecting democratic processes and the rule of law and security, not just because of the risk of perception issues, but to give our people a fair chance to live and prosper, to live well and to prosper. 3, focus our economic growth and development plans on these green opportunities and structure internal policies and regulations in ways that support climate-positive trade and industry. 4, actively work on harmonizing trade and environmental and industrial policies across the continent so as to ensure a level playing field. And this is particularly important because the Guided Trade Initiative, or the GTI, of the Free Trade Agreement, and this GTI is really a test run for the Free Trade Agreement, has shown weaknesses in the implementation of the agreement on account of domestic taxes and levies in destination countries. So we need to work on that. 5, we need stronger and deeper African capital markets and African financial institutions, because these are going to be key to our investment attractiveness as we go along. And that requires work in individual countries, in collaboration between countries and in collective institutions. 6, we need to develop critical infrastructure, especially climate-resilient infrastructure, to support industry and trade. Happily, there is significant progress in that regard. Afrexim has invested a total of almost $2 billion in the development of special economic zones in several African countries. The Gabon Special Economic Zone, which focuses on the timber industry, has created so far about 16,000 jobs and attracted 120 investors, and has enabled Gabon to move from being an exporter of logs to the world's second largest sustainable producer and exporter of veneer, as well as the first in Africa. The Glo-Jigbe Industrial Zone in the Benin Republic is dedicated to the local transformation of agricultural products, including cotton, cashews, pineapples, shea nuts, and soybeans. There's also the Adetikope Industrial Platform in Togo, which concentrates on the local transformation of agricultural products. And other zones are being developed in the Republic of Congo, in Ivory Coast, in Nigeria also, in Chad, in the DRC, in Rwanda, and also in Sierra Leone. Also, the bank has led on the financing of several cross-border infrastructure, including the Tanzania-Isaka, the Isaka-Mwanza Standard Gauge Railway, for the transportation of goods and passengers to neighboring countries. Also, the Kano-Maradi Standard Gauge Rail, and that's an important link between Niger, the Niger Republic's major commercial hub, and the commercial city of Kano in northern Nigeria. Then there's the Abidjan-Lagos Corridor, the highway project, which spans over 1,000 kilometers and connects the capitals and economic centers of 5 ECOWAS member states, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. But what sort of global collaboration do we need to make if climate-positive growth is to become a reality in trade and industry? The first is the right type and amount of investments and capital. Today, real and perceived risk factors mean that our cost of capital is much higher than elsewhere, and it is undoing much, if not all, of our innate climate competitiveness. The Climate Action Platform for Africa, CAP-A, whose board I chair, analyzed the missed opportunity due to cost of capital. And we found that just projects that did go through a conservative assumption of 20% higher cost of capital in Africa meant that we missed out on 27 terawatt hours of renewable energy capacity in the past 10 years, which is 20% of Africa's entire electricity use, just from cost of capital. In reality, we probably miss out on a lot more, because the cost of capital in Africa is often in orders of magnitude much higher, because if you borrow from the capital markets, it's about 5 times higher than everybody else pays. Because even at twice the cost, half the potential capacity is already foregone. And this is not even counting the projects that don't even reach that investment hurdle in the first place and get scrapped altogether because of the cost of capital. So addressing the issue of shortage of capital and cost of capital will require a range of interventions that all need to be delivered on. I'll just dwell on a very few of them. The first is that we require the developed countries to keep the past promises under the Paris treaties. including the activation of the Loss and Damage Fund, agreed at COP27, and the commitment to $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries agreed nearly 10 years ago. The second is the reform of the international financial architecture. And these have been identified, as most of us know, in the Bridgetown Initiative and the Capital Adequacy Framework, amongst others. And they include a wide range of tools that increase and strengthen the balance sheets of MDBs, ensure more of their deployment goes to emerging and frontier economies, and drive more deployment towards climate-aligned investments. And then technical solutions such as recycling of SDRs, the special drawing rights, smart capital blending, and tailored risk mitigation and interventions will also support this. The third is dealing with the huge burden of sovereign debt. About a year ago, in a jointly authored article that is titled, "If you want our countries to address climate change, first pause our debts," end of quote, a co-authorship by President Ruto of Kenya, Dr. Akin Adesina of the AFDB, and Musa Faki, President of the AU Commission, reiterated a call for a 10-year moratorium on interest payments on African foreign debt to give the world's most vulnerable countries the space to invest in climate resilience and other pressing needs, such as health and education. They also argued for more climate-targeted debt relief. Well, there's a bolder initiative. This is an initiative called the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery Project. And this is endorsed by 41 retired African Central Bank governors and ministers of finance. The plan seeks debt reductions in the case of public creditors, debt reductions that will be sufficient to bring a distressed country back to debt sustainability, but also to put the country on the path of achieving development and climate goals in a manner that also preserves the credit status and credit ratings of the participating international organizations. Under the proposal, private and commercial creditors should grant commensurate debt reduction as public creditors. And these private creditors will be compelled to enter negotiations through Brady bonds backed by a guarantee fund and a payment standstill for 5 years for all creditor classes. The fourth is identifying new and additional sources of finance, investment capital and liquidity through perhaps new levies, carbon prices and taxation. And that's a whole, broad field by itself. And of course, as you know, a lot of conversations are going on about that. The fifth is adopting the common sense and, I believe, fair approach of revaluing Africa's GDP by including its natural capital, its vast natural resources, particularly carbon sequestration and biodiversity. Akinwumi Adesina, Ben Orama, and UNECA, that's the UN ECA, have all made strong cases that Africa's natural capital should not only be recognized in our economic growth models, but also monetized, which would enable African countries to secure more funding for greening their economies. I believe the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I think that this is also an important point to make as I close. It's not about Africa saying that it will trade within itself alone and ignore the world. Certainly not. I think what the agreement does is that it empowers African countries, first, to add value to raw materials in a sustainable manner and specialize in areas of national comparative advantage, and also to work together to trade more beneficially with the rest of the world. I think that is really the point, that one would like to make about the potential of the AfCFTA, not just for African countries, but also for the rest of the world. But let me conclude by saying that yes, we can save lives today and preserve the planet for tomorrow. Indeed, Africa saving lives by a climate-positive growth path is the key to preserving the planet for tomorrow. But we need global patriots and statesmen and women, both in the North and the South, to make the sacrifices that will secure not just Africa, but our planet for future generations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. So, Excellency, after a thesis, we dissect it and we try and pick it apart, as they say. So, but firstly, when I heard that you're going to be our guest lecturer tonight, I was delighted, but also asked my friends from Nigeria and beyond what they knew about you. They said, okay, you'll obviously see his high intellect, but you'll also meet someone who's genuine, who's humble, who's grounded, who's calm. So I wanted to understand your leadership style and how have you managed to be grounded and keep or be the human being that you are today?
Okay. I think first, if you have I think if one is just honest with oneself, I mean, you can't but be grounded, because the truth is that what you don't know is so much more than what you know. So one just has to approach things from that perspective. I think it helps that I'm a teacher, and I think teachers are probably the humblest human beings anywhere, because you are forever being tackled by people who haven't read anything, who don't know anything, and who just raise their hands from the back of the class and say you're wrong. So I'm sort of accustomed to that from teaching for very many years. So I think that helps. And of course, faith is also important for me in particular. I'm a Christian. I believe very strongly that my values as a Christian are crucial in just the way that my worldview and also how I look at, the wide variety of issues, yes.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that all the people who are watching online and can learn from your leadership style. So after leaving office, you focused on a couple of initiatives, I believe. One is Timbuktu, which is a $1 billion fund to enhance our tech and innovative ecosystem on the continent. The other one, of course, is around climate change. You're a global advisor to GAP. You're supporting the just energy transition in Africa and other initiatives. So why did you choose those two, innovation and climate?
Well, I think the choice is just based on the fact that that is the future. There's no way of looking at our world going forward without addressing the climate crisis. And of course, innovation is a future for Africa, and for just the millions of young people who every day, are looking for opportunities. So I think it's just paying attention to the future. That really is, yeah.
Okay, so now we come to your lecture. I've taken a few notes. One, you said we need to speak with one voice in terms of on the international stage and in shaping our own policy. How hard and how complicated was it in reality when you were in office for Africa to speak with one voice and to be united and to go, when we are invited to the table, to go with a clear strategy and clear demands?
It's always been difficult. I think that first, when we speak of Africa almost as if it were a country, And I think it's good to speak of Africa in that way because it really does demonstrate the potential. But it's difficult to get people to work together. But I think that now it's getting a lot easier as we see the commercial benefit, as we see the economic benefit of working together. And I think it's becoming more obvious that we're able to work together. For example, the Africa Climate Summit saw, a lot of African countries coming together, the AU endorsing the climate positive growth plan as the economic paradigm for Africa, Marrakesh Declaration and all the work that went into it. I think that there is far greater appetite for collaboration now and for working together now than ever before. So I think that things are looking up, from that perspective. But obviously, it's not an easy thing at all. No.
Okay, so we will be taking questions from the floor. You said that Babacar Ndiaye said Senegal is his village, Africa is his country. So, Professor, Nigeria is his village, but Africa is his country, and we want questions more to do with Africa than to do with Nigeria specifically. He's left office, so that's no longer his responsibility. So if you make sure that the questions are focused on the African and more general issues rather than just Nigeria, please. But there was one point, actually. So you mentioned fossil fuels. So fossil fuels today in Africa probably attracts 8% of global investments, whilst renewables only attracts 1% of global investments. So how can we get renewables to become sort of the 8% like fossil fuels is today?
I think it's making a strong economic case for it. In fact, I think it was just this week, there's an article that looks at the whole question of which way the hedge funds are betting. And it's clear that the hedge funds are betting against green, which is bothersome, right? But the point really is that this, no matter how we slice it, this is the future. The future is green, and we're just going to keep making that strong case. And I think that for us in Africa in particular, we need to be able to prepare the economic case just in more positive terms and with a lot, undergirding it with a lot more, the practical, common sense approach to it, just so that everyone understands that this is viable, it's going to happen, and the first to get there will benefit. Yeah.
You called for global cooperation.
Yes.
But, so I'm from Tunisia, despite my British accent, and I was brought up as a sort of anti-colonial, shouldn't be saying it here, but yes, anti-French, and, we own our own destiny. So, when you speak to the global north, are they really serious? Or is it double standards that, as you mentioned, are they willing? They pledged $100 billion, but people have told me that's bogus money, ultimately. It's another pledge that's not going to be realized.
I think that really working together is inevitable. That's absolutely the way to go. And of course, we must also make room for national interests, for regional interests. All of this is at play. And for me, the most important thing is for Africa to be at the table in an informed, and in an informed and proactive way. So in dealing with these issues, we're fully aware of what the other side is thinking. We're fully aware of how everyone is thinking, what their interests are, and how we can accommodate those interests and at the same time do our business well. So I think that the point really is that everyone is going to take care of their own interests, and there's no point thinking that we're necessarily going to be cut some slack by the global north. But we must be able to let everyone understand, north and south, that the future is absolutely going to depend on our working together. And in my view, especially on this issue of climate positive growth for Africa, because we really have no choice. If Africa doesn't go that path, no one is going to be able to get to net zero by 2050 or even so soon thereafter. Africa absolutely must be invested in to go on the pathway of climate positive growth in order to enable the world to achieve its net zero objectives. So there's a partnership here that has to happen. So I think it's just everyone recognizing how important, this is for the entire world. Yeah.
But the partnerships, who's it going to be? Is it going to be with other countries on a bilateral level? Or is it going to be with the philanthropy? Or is it going to be strengthening our DFIs and letting them drive the African agenda?
Well, everyone is going to pitch into this. Everyone's going to pitch in. But the most important thing is for people to recognize the economic opportunities, because that's what will drive this. The economic opportunities for climate positive growth, recognizing that, just some of the examples we've given, recognizing that it makes far more sense for beneficiation of ores and minerals in situ, where you have renewable energy for purposes of manufacture, for purposes of processing, rather than taking the same ores halfway across the world, beneficiating halfway across the world and shipping them back and forth. So I think that we're all beginning to see, and we will all see, that this is the way to go. And I think, that just makes it clearer. Everyone is going to pitch in because it will make commercial sense for everyone.
So from where you're sitting, you're seeing progress on that front. The penny is dropping.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we've got questions from the floor. If you can put your hand up, there'll be some roving mics. So we've got quite a few. We'll probably take 3 questions and then we'll come back. So take one there, one here, and one there as well. Well, I'll come back to you, so we'll take 3. So it's one there, that gentleman there. If you can stand up so that they can come and bring the mic to you. Then we'll take a question here, and then the table there. You can keep them brief as well, please. Is there a mic there for this gentleman? Go ahead, go ahead, and I'll try and synthesize it.
Okay. For the Q&A. I thought they were. The Q&A is happening. Oh. Okay, I'm in the back corner. Far corner. So that you.
The next things on the agenda towards economic integration now that we have the agreement.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Madam?
I don't know where Michelle went.
To ask now. My name is Eden Harris. I'm a special correspondent with Connecting Africa. I want to know how can the U.S. or even Africa use technology to address the climate crisis that's happening in Africa? Who's going next?
Thank you very much. My name is Kahir Danani, and I really appreciate all of your comments today. I think it's the most comprehensive and clear address on this topic in a very long time, or ever, if I may say so. My question is about your notion of coming together with a common voice and coming together with that common purpose. I think that the private sector has a critical role in this. And I'm curious about your views of how the private sector comes together with a common voice in Africa, not only as African companies together, but within their countries and in relation to the AFCFTA. Because the pressure is felt by the companies. It's by individual enterprises that have this challenge to cross borders, to bring those goods across from Tanzania to DRC or wherever, as you mentioned. And this is a particularly important area, so I'd be curious for that. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take the one on physical infrastructure. I think it's evidently a problem, and which is why I made the point that there is a fair amount of work going on. Some of the work that Afrexim has been doing around climate resilient infrastructure. And the AFDB also has done some work around climate resilient infrastructure. I think the point really is that there is a need for more resources to build up this sort of infrastructure. There's just a need for putting more resources into it. What we're seeing, of course, is that it's not just, the brick and mortar, if you like. There's technology as well. There is, building up the cyber corridors, making sure that we're able to, connect across the entire, across the entire continent. And all of these are related to money, to resources. One of the ways by which I think we can attract those resources is by showing the economic opportunities that exist, not just for Africans within Africa, but also for the, for the global investor. So for example, if you look at the renewable energy issue, so the renewable energy issue is one where we think that if we attract investments, the investments will create the anchor demand. Because really, it doesn't make very much sense. If we talk about power all over Africa, it's difficult as an economic proposition to say that if you can power the whole of Africa just using, just the way that you power anywhere else. Someone has to pay for it. Now, a lot of that payment is going to be by cross subsidies of one kind or the other. Now, that can only come if we have an anchor demand, massive anchor demand, coming from industry that see themselves as big investors in some of the big manufacturing or big beneficiation processes that will emerge if we go the pathway that we want to go. So that will help in building out, energy infrastructure and all that. So I think, we will, with a combination of what the MDBs are doing, what Afreximbank FDB are doing, and what countries are doing also, be able to build this out. And I think that once the economic sense of this, once the economic benefits are obvious, countries will invest more on building out infrastructure to connect each other. How to use technology to address the climate crisis. I think that, there are very many possibilities. But one of the things that I've found, for example, is that, so the climate crisis affects practically everything, right? It affects, for example, even in some of our countries, it affects educational opportunities. It affects healthcare. It affects everything, right? Because, of the devastation that's taking place and all that. So there's a need for us to focus on those things that would enable our people to prosper. And one of the critical things for me is investment in human resources, as opposed to just in, structures, etc. So investments in education, for example, is important even in resolving the climate crisis, because a lot of what we need, a lot of the technology, a lot of everything we're talking about will depend on human capacity. So we definitely need to invest in human resources. Now, take it, for example, we have in Nigeria, we have a substantial number of young people who should be in school, who are not in school. But we have an opportunity now with AI to very quickly educate young people. And we can actually leapfrog. With just a Starlink connection, in fact, I was having a conversation today on that. With just a Starlink connection, and a device, AI today is able to do incredible things, teach young people at their own pace and all that. We have a radio school project, which just changing that around and using AI can actually just transform by many, many, many times over the speed of learning and all of that. So I think that for me, I would not be thinking too much in terms of, I think for me, the primary thing is how can we develop human resources in such a way as to challenge the climate crisis. Because at the end of the day, it's down to human resources. It's down to what human beings are able to do. And we have a huge young population, critical minerals are there, but you need the technology to be able to do so. And it's these young men and women who are going to, be. So I prefer to approach it from that end rather than, in terms of, what technology would do by itself. I think the last question is coming together with a common goal.
And the private sector.
The private sector, yes. Well, the truth is that we need to do more country platforms for this purpose. And really, I think that in the past few years, the private sector has come more, has come more, has become more of a partner to the public sector in very, very many ways. I think that the public sector realizes, and my experience is that the public sector realizes that it's almost impossible to, just based on the resources available, it's almost impossible for the public sector to achieve its aims or goals for the people in any concrete way. So for example, in Nigeria, it would take a Dangote to build a 650,000 barrel a day, refinery. That's 20 billion US dollars. External reserves today are somewhere in the order of 37, 38 billion US dollars. So it's clear that without the private sector, you really can't do much. And the private sector is really the major contributor. I think that everyone is coming to that realization, and that will help a great deal so that we're able to support the private sector in terms of rules, regulations, and just creating the enabling environment for the private sector to work. And frankly, I think that that's the direction that Africa not only has to go, but will go, going by what we're seeing today.
Excellent. We've got a question from our virtual audience. So in terms of the AFCFTA, what are the opportunities for ensuring that the AFCFTA, and by extension the Secretariat, produces positive influences on climate action and the continent environmental sustainability? So basically, what's the role of the AFCFTA to drive climate action and that positive climate growth?
Yeah. I think that without necessarily saying so in the climate agreements, because if you look at the agreement, it doesn't specifically talk about the climate crisis in any specific way. But I think it's obvious now from the implementation that we absolutely need to address climate concerns and the climate crisis. So it's really more a matter of going forward, how do we use the free trade agreements to tackle some of these problems? And I think that that's obvious in some of what we're seeing already and some of what I've said, that even just trading, first of all, ensuring local beneficiation, ensuring local processing begins to address it. Using renewable energy begins to address some of these concerns. So I think that those things are important, the way that we use, the way that we apply the free trade agreements, Of course, trading within ourselves also addresses the climate concern and all that. And I think that now, with what we're seeing with the Guided Trade Initiative, it's becoming obvious that these are some of the concerns that we have to address. And I think that is becoming very obvious to the operators too. Yes.
Excellent. We'll take two more questions. There's a question here. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
I'm the president of the constituency for Africa here in Washington. I'm an African born in America. And my question to you, what is the role of the African diaspora in helping Africa address the issue of the climate change? What do you want us to do?
Okay, and there's a question there with the chap with the cap.
Yeah, I'm Adnan Hassan. I served on the board of directors of the World Bank, and I'm an investor. And I actually wanted to pick up on this question about the diaspora, and in particular, the young diaspora. 60% of Africa is under 21 or 25 years old, and there must be a very talented diaspora of folks who are interested in investing back in Africa. And every, I think, young African is walking around with technology that send man to the moon. So, and I'm sure for those of you who have children, they are completely connected now to technology in all of Africa also. So how can you link the diaspora dynamism with the dynamism in Africa? Thank you.
You can pass the mic behind you. There's someone who I think wanted to ask a question as well. There's the gentleman there. Yeah.
There was one hand up here. Is that okay?
Sorry, and the lady as well. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you're next.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Camille Olufobi. I run an organization called the Most Influential People of African Descent, MIPAD. Omar, thank you very much for moderating this. It's always a pleasure to be in the same room as Professor Shibajo. Always a great intellect. My question to you is, you clearly laid out what needs to be done. My sense is Africa keeps asking for permission to do the right thing. You've clearly laid it out. My question to you is, why do we consistently ask the West for permission to do what is right for Africa?
And then the final question, this lady here.
I'll piggyback on that. Good evening. My name is Dr. Nkemo Keke. I'm the founder of Business Integrated Network in Diaspora, and this focus on businesses that are high net worth trying to improve U.S.-Africa trade. So leveraging on what the former folks have questioned, since environmental protection is mainly influenced from outside of Africa, what leverage do African leaders truly really have, and what can we in the diaspora private sector do to influence this? I would like to hear your thoughts, His Excellency. Thank you.
You can probably combine the questions in diaspora and.
Sure. Okay. Let me take the question about asking permission first. I think that first, I think we're in a different sort of mindset, because what we're saying now is that there is a pathway for the world to deal with the climate crisis. And we're saying that it is inevitable that this will be the approach. Fortunately for us, we face an apocalypse. So everyone's mind, whether now or in the future, will be concentrated on avoiding the apocalypse. So what we're saying now is not a matter of asking permission. It's a matter of saying, guys, we're looking at the end of the world. This is a solution. Let's do it. I think that we're talking now about collaboration and partnership. That's important. You know, if we believe the scientists, that will save the world. I don't think it's really asking permission, in my respectful view. I think that really it's a proposal. We're making a positive proposal, and it's thought through, and we continue to refine and think it through. But I think it's really how, in my view, the world will have to react to this one way or the other. Okay, then there's a question about the diaspora and leverage, what the African diaspora can do. I think, as always, the diaspora is important, because first, the diaspora is able, as a strong lobby, to impress upon, the relevant agencies, authorities, and all of that, what the African viewpoint is. Unfortunately, when we speak of the diaspora, we're speaking of a very amorphous group. So this is not an organized group that is necessarily thinking in the same way. But then there are diaspora organizations and groups that already are in partnership with several African governments and are working with African governments around climate, around healthcare, around education, and all that. I think expanding that, expanding the scope of that, and then trying to see how we can aggregate the force of the diaspora in a concrete way is one of the useful things that can be done from the diaspora. I think that organization must take place in the diaspora itself, as opposed to coming from Africa. And that would be very helpful if we're able to get that kind of synergy. And then, that then works itself into the problems that we have, the African issues and problems that we have. But I think that, at the moment we do have, but it's not, there is no synergy as such. We see several diaspora organizations working here. In Nigeria, for example, we have a diaspora commission which tries to work with Nigerians in diaspora on various topics. But that's hardly enough for the sort of sea change that we want to see in Africa. I think
you've covered them. So I think we've really relished having you here. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your consideration. So for me, it's been an absolute privilege. And you're a proud dad, a proud grandpa. When I share a floor with such remarkable leadership, I'm a proud African. Thank you so much. So next, we've got a video message from Mrs. Amina J. Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations.
His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Dr. Benedict Orama, President of Afreximbank, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to join this group of leaders from states, local governments, businesses and universities. Your gathering comes at a critical moment of truth in our fight against the climate crisis. The window of opportunity to keep the 1.5-degree limit within reach and prevent the worst impacts of climate change is almost closed. At the current levels of warming, we are already witnessing unprecedented climate in cities, countries, and continents across our planet, including across Africa. This year, we've seen drought disasters declared across southern Africa and extreme rains and flooding in East and West Africa. Meanwhile, many African countries are mired in debt, exacerbated by extended crises, with little access to long-term concessional financing to invest in sustainable development. The current debt framework is inadequate for effective debt relief that allows fiscal space needed to respond to the basic needs of their population and protect them from the ravages of a climate crisis they did nothing to create. We must support Africa to unlock its huge potential and ambition to become a renewable energy superpower in 3 key ways. First, we need far greater climate ambition, with the major economies leading the way. All governments must present new 1.5 aligned NDCs well ahead of COP30 in Brazil. In particular, the G20, who make up over 80% of the current emissions. These climate plans must be economy-wide, covering all sectors and all greenhouse gases, and show how each country intends to transition away from fossil fuels, these being just transitions. For developing countries, these NDCs are an opportunity to align climate plans with national investment plans, spurring just transitions and sustainable development. Second, Africa needs means of implementation to support and meet its climate ambition. With adequate access to financial resources at a reasonable cost and technological support, renewables could dramatically boost economies, grow new industries, create jobs, and drive development, including by reaching the over 600 million Africans living without access to power. Last year, just 15% of new clean energy investment went to emerging markets and developing economies outside China, countries representing nearly 2/3 of the world's population. And Africa was home to less than 1% of last year's renewable installations, despite its wealth of natural resources and vast renewables potential. The International Energy Agency reports that clean energy investments in developing and emerging economies beyond China need to reach up to $1.7 trillion a year by early 2030s. In short, we need a massive expansion of affordable public and private finance to fuel ambitious new climate plans and deliver clean, affordable energy for all. And third, delivering climate justice for Africa. This means addressing well-known challenges faced by developing countries: high cost of capital, high levels of indebtedness, and insufficient risk-bearing and affordable capital, and driving further progress in reforming the international financial architecture and urgently closing the adaptation finance gap. Finally, the private sector must also play its part through credible climate commitments aligned with the Paris Agreement and business practices that put people and planet first. This is a moment of truth, and it demands nothing short of maximum ambition, acceleration, and cooperation. However, we cannot overlook the importance of empowering our women and youth in the climate action agenda. Women and young people are on the front lines of the climate crisis, often the most affected, but also the most innovative and resilient in responding to its challenges. The African Continental Free Trade Area has the potential to create millions of jobs and open up opportunities for women and youth to be central players in green industrialization. Let us ensure that in building climate-resilient economies, we are prioritizing inclusive policies that empower women and youth to shape Africa's sustainable future. Excellencies, friends, by harnessing the collective might of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Africa can make strides in addressing both climate action and sustainable development. By promoting regional integration and fostering green industrialization, AFSCTA can help build climate-resilient economies and at the same time create jobs, reduce poverty, and strengthen food security. Now is the time to act as one to deliver the climate justice and solidarity that all Africans demand and deserve. The United Nations is happy to stand with you and continue to work tirelessly to help build the trust, find the solutions, and inspire the cooperation our world so desperately needs. Thank you.
You've been watching an Arise News live coverage.